Hemel Hempstead, a peaceful town in Hertfordshire, England, had long been known for its suburban calm, a place where industry and community lived side by side. But on its northern edge stood a behemoth of the petroleum world, the Buncefield Oil Storage Depot. Built in the late 1960s, during the height of Britain's post-war industrial expansion, the depot was conceived as part of the country's strategic energy infrastructure. Fuel storage sites like Buncefield were essential for ensuring that London and the surrounding regions never faced shortages of petrol, diesel, or aviation fuel. By the early 2000s, Buncefield had become one of the largest fuel storage and distribution terminals in the United Kingdom, and indeed in all of Western Europe. Covering more than 45 acres, it was a sprawling network of pipelines, tanks, valves, and pumps. Its storage capacity exceeded 60 million liters of fuel, divided among 22 enormous cylindrical tanks, each capable of holding millions of liters of gasoline, diesel, or jet fuel. The site was strategically vital. Pipelines connected it directly to refineries and airports. From Buncefield, aviation fuel was supplied to Heathrow, Luton, and Gatwick, while petrol and diesel were distributed by road tankers across the southeast. The depot operated around the clock, a complex choreography of pumping, measuring, and monitoring. The facility was run by Hertfordshire Oil Storage Limited (HSL), a joint venture between Total UK Ltd and Chevron Limited. Several other companies also leased space within the site, including BP, Shell, and British Pipeline Agency Ltd. To the surrounding businesses, Buncefield was simply part of the industrial landscape, humming quietly behind fences and security gates. The nearby Maylands Industrial Estate, home to hundreds of warehouses, logistics companies, and small firms, thrived on its proximity. Over the years, the area had expanded outward, with new offices and retail spaces creeping closer to the depot's perimeter. Few residents or workers thought much about the danger of storing such massive quantities of flammable material so close to human activity. Britain's fuel infrastructure was considered among the safest in the world, managed by companies with decades of experience. Safety systems, such as automatic shutoff valves, pressure gauges, and emergency overflow controls, were in place to prevent accidents. But as later investigations revealed, these systems were only as strong as their maintenance. And by the early 2000s, cracks, both literal and figurative, had begun to appear in the foundation of Buncefield's safety culture. Years of cost-cutting, poor communication between operating companies, and a gradual erosion of technical diligence had left the site vulnerable. Safety mechanisms weren't being tested as frequently as they should have been. Warning signals went unnoticed. Minor faults were tolerated as normal. Unseen by anyone, the stage was being set for a disaster of almost unimaginable scale, one that would shake the ground like an earthquake, destroy millions in property, and scar the skies above Hemel Hempstead for days. The date was Sunday, December 11, 2005. It was a still, cold winter morning. The streets of Hemel Hempstead were quiet, a blessing as it turned out. Few workers were in the industrial estate. Offices were closed and the depot itself was operating with minimal staff. At 3 a.m., Tank 912, one of Buncefield's massive storage tanks, began to receive unleaded petrol through an underground pipeline from the Corryton refinery in Essex, nearly 90 miles away. The inflow rate was tremendous, roughly 550 cubic meters of fuel per hour, or about 500,000 liters every 60 minutes. The tank's measuring system, known as a servo gauge, was supposed to monitor fuel levels precisely and send automatic signals to halt the flow once capacity was reached. In addition, a separate independent high-level switch (ICE) served as a failsafe. If the tank got too full, the switch would physically trip and shut off the incoming fuel. But that morning both systems failed. The gauge had become stuck days earlier, freezing the indicator at a false reading that made it appear the tank had plenty of room left. The high-level switch, meanwhile, had not been properly maintained. Its internal parts were jammed, and the device had not been inspected according to proper standards. By 5:30 a.m., Tank 912 was already full, yet fuel continued to pour in. At some point between 5:38 and 5:52 a.m., petrol began to overflow from a vent pipe at the top of the tank. Initially, this would have appeared as a shimmering cascade of liquid spilling down the metal walls. But within minutes, the situation turned deadly. As the petrol splashed onto the cold ground, it rapidly vaporized, forming a thick, invisible cloud of highly flammable vapor. The liquid spread across the containment area, pooling near the ground and creeping silently into adjacent parts of the depot. Security cameras recorded an eerie sight, a thin mist drifting low and wide, moving like fog between the tanks and fences. The vapor cloud expanded outward across the site and into nearby roadways, covering an estimated area of 80,000 square meters, the size of more than a dozen football fields. It was a ticking time bomb waiting for a single spark. At 6:01 a.m. that spark came. No one knows the exact ignition source. It could have been the spark from a vehicle starter motor, a running generator, or even static discharge. But the effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. A massive explosion tore through the air, shattering the pre-dawn stillness. Witnesses miles away described a blinding flash followed by a deep, concussive roar. The shockwave was so powerful that it registered 2.4 on the Richter scale, equivalent to a small earthquake. Buildings within a kilometer radius were instantly devastated. Windows shattered up to 3 miles away and doors were blown off their hinges. In nearby neighborhoods, people were thrown from their beds by the force of the blast. One resident later said it felt as if a bomb had dropped directly on us. The explosion triggered secondary blasts as other tanks ignited. Within minutes, Buncefield was a sea of fire. Columns of flame rose hundreds of feet into the air, feeding on millions of liters of fuel. Firefighters from across southern England were mobilized in one of the largest emergency responses since World War II. More than 600 firefighters, supported by 32 fire engines, foam tenders, and specialist hazard units, battled the inferno. By dawn, the fire was fully out of control. Flames as high as 150 meters shot into the sky, and black smoke billowed 2 kilometers upward, visible as far away as Belgium and France. Meteorological satellites orbiting Earth even captured images of the smoke plume drifting east over the English Channel. For 3 days, Buncefield burned like a volcano. The sound of roaring fire and cracking metal echoed through Hemel Hempstead. The heat was so intense that cars parked nearby melted into pools of aluminum, and trees burst into flames simply from radiant heat. Astonishingly, and perhaps miraculously, no one was killed. The explosion had occurred at a time when most workers were off-site. Had it been a weekday morning, experts later estimated the death toll could have been in the hundreds. Still, 43 people were injured, including fuel terminal workers, security guards, and nearby residents. 2 were critically hurt. Thousands of others were left shaken, homeless, or jobless as fires consumed their workplaces. By Thursday, December 15, 2005, after nearly 3.5 days, the last flames were finally extinguished. It had taken more than 250,000 liters of firefighting foam, continuous pumping, and tireless work from hundreds of emergency responders. The fire service called it the most challenging peacetime operation in living memory. When the smoke cleared, the devastation was overwhelming. The Buncefield Depot was a charred ruin. Every tank was either destroyed or severely damaged. Surrounding buildings, offices, warehouses, car dealerships, and factories were flattened. The total number of damaged buildings exceeded 2,000, with hundreds completely destroyed. The blast's economic impact was staggering. Insurance claims topped £700 million, and the total cost of damage, cleanup, and compensation exceeded £1 billion. Thousands of workers were displaced, and dozens of businesses were forced to close permanently. Residents described surreal scenes: entire streets coated in ash, windows shattered across neighborhoods, and a lingering stench of petrol that hung in the air for weeks. Cleanup crews in protective gear worked day and night to remove contaminated soil, burned debris, and thousands of tons of ruined material. The investigation. The British government launched a major inquiry, led by the Health and Safety Executive, HSE, and the Environment Agency, EA. Over the next several years, investigators pieced together a picture of systemic failure. Not a single catastrophic mistake, but a chain of smaller errors and oversights that had built up over time. Their final reports concluded that the disaster was entirely preventable. The key findings were: the level gauge on tank 912 had been stuck for at least 2 days before the incident. The independent high-level switch, which should have automatically stopped the inflow, was jammed due to poor maintenance. There was no alarm system to alert operators to an overflow. Fuel was being pumped in too quickly, overwhelming containment systems. The site's safety culture was inadequate, procedures were poorly documented, staff training was inconsistent, and oversight between joint operators was weak. The inquiry described the explosion as the result of a cascade of technical and managerial failures, emphasizing that robust safety protocols existed but were not being enforced. In 2010, after a lengthy court process, several companies were held legally responsible. Total UK Ltd was fined £3.6 million and ordered to pay £2.6 million in costs. Hertfordshire Oil Storage Ltd was fined £1.45 million. British Pipeline Agency Ltd and Motherwell Control Systems 2003 Ltd were also found guilty of safety and environmental breaches. Judge David Calvert-Smith, in sentencing, stated that simple maintenance and attention to warning signals could have avoided the entire tragedy. Environmental consequences. The environmental impact was severe and long-lasting. The explosion released vast amounts of toxic chemicals, including benzene, toluene, and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons (PAHs. The dense black smoke plume contaminated air across southern England. Runoff from firefighting foam, mixed with fuel residues, seeped into the ground, threatening local water supplies. Massive cleanup operations were required to remove contaminated soil and prevent groundwater pollution. Some areas had to be excavated to a depth of several meters. For years, the Environment Agency continued to monitor groundwater and soil quality. The site became a case study in how industrial accidents can ripple across ecosystems for decades. Cultural and safety impact. The Buncefield disaster profoundly changed how the UK and Europe regulated fuel storage facilities. New safety frameworks were introduced, focusing on process safety management, automatic overflow detection, continuous monitoring, and risk assessment auditing. Sites across the UK were inspected to ensure compliance with updated safety codes under the Control of Major Accident Hazards (COMA) regulations. The event also served as a wake-up call for emergency planners. Coordination between fire services, environmental agencies, and private operators was restructured to allow for faster, more unified responses to industrial crises. For local residents, however, the scars were personal. 4 months after the explosion, people reported sleep disturbances, anxiety, and PTSD-like symptoms from the shock of being woken by an explosion that sounded like a bomb. Some never returned to their homes. Today, the Buncefield site bears little resemblance to the fiery wasteland of 2005. Most of the damaged tanks have been demolished, and parts of the area have been redeveloped. But reminders of the explosion are embedded in the town's history. Memorials, safety displays, and even local emergency drills still reference that fateful December morning. Experts now look back at Buncefield as one of the most significant industrial disasters in modern British history, alongside tragedies like Flixborough, 1974, and Piper Alpha, 1988. It stands as a lesson written in fire, that technology cannot replace vigilance, and that when safety systems fail, the consequences can be seismic. On that cold December morning in 2005, the people of Hemel Hempstead awoke to what many described as the sound of war. But in the years that followed, they rebuilt, stronger, wiser, and determined that such a night would never come again.